This is not an official podcast of the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution, NSDAR, and does not necessarily represent the position of the NSDAR.
This is Kate Goldberg from Maryland. I enjoyed this series. I felt like I was sitting at the kitchen table just sipping tea or coffee. So I just felt like I was right there, kind of like a family member listening. I was always waiting to hear about some auntie who knew all the family secrets and had just been waiting to tell somebody, because I think I'm that auntie in my family. And sometimes I had to stop and I was like, what did she say? And rewind it and listen again, because there are sometimes in the stories that there's twists.
This is Liz Deering, and I'm from Maryland. And I've really enjoyed listening to the podcast series Daughter Dialogues. I was curious to see how women of color were able to find their ancestors. Doing some African American research myself, it's very difficult. I'm just really amazed at how remarkable each of these women are. This series has successfully documented exceptional oral history for now and generations to come.
This is Risha Rainey, host of the Daughter Dialogues podcast. This episode won't be like the usual interviews. Over the past 4 months, you have heard from Black women who are direct descendants of men who helped the United States earn its independence, and they have proven their lineage through membership in the Daughters of the American Revolution. I have been documenting their oral histories as a non-resident fellow of the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute at Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, which is under the direction of Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr., host of the popular PBS special, Finding Your Roots. This particular episode will mark the end of season 1. I recently decided to break up the Daughter Dialogues podcast series into seasons for a couple of reasons. Let's start with the simple fact that, so Michelle Weary came up with the idea of my disseminating my research in the form of a podcast. I had started this research for the Daughter Dialogues project several years ago, but it really took traction this year. And about mid-June, Michelle said, hey, why don't you put this out as a podcast? I took on that challenge, and she was very adamant that it should be released in observance of Independence Day, since these women descended from men who contributed to the cause for freedom of the United States of America. So at that point, I had never even listened to a podcast myself. And I was about 2 weeks out from this July 1st launch date. I had to learn not only how to podcast, listen to some podcast, understand it, get the equipment, bring it up on board, learn how to edit the audio, how to publish, etc., all in about 2.5 weeks. I got it done, but there was the expense of not having episodes in the bank. So that meant that if I were to publish on a weekly basis, which is the industry standard for having to release on a consistent basis, that meant that I was going to be going basically week to week, or an analogy, check to check, with no episodes in the reserve. Something I had to always remind my participants and even some of the listeners that this isn't a podcast. Although you are listening to these stories and the narratives of these women in the form of a podcast, this really is a research project. And the primary goal is to document these narratives for deposit into the archives of a library, which we will talk more about later. So considering that as the objective, according to research standards, oral histories typically take 3 weeks per interview subject, because there's more to it than simply talking or chatting with the person. There is research involved prior to the interview, as well as documentation that must follow the interview. And I have been going at a pace much faster by interviewing and documenting the narratives at the rate of 1 week per research subject. So the decision to go into seasons allows me the opportunity to work closer to a more normal pace for an oral history project and have those interviews ready for you for season 2. And also the poor women that I interviewed, they were such incredible sports. Because I was going from week to week, I didn't really have time to give them advance warning that I'd be calling on them next. And they were always very gracious and flexible to sometimes record the next day with only 1 day's notice. And I'm just sure that my luck would run out from doing that. The pause between seasons is also necessary to provide time to disseminate this research in other methods and means other than the podcast, as well as prepare documentation and the recordings for deposit into the library archives. Daughter Dialogue Season 2 will begin on the first Thursday of February, which coincides with Black History Month. So here's a rundown of what you will hear in this episode. First, we will review Season 1, and I will share some observations with you. And then we will have some shout outs to listeners and hear some of their comments directly from them. After that, we're going to do something that I really love, which is to geek out on numbers. I will talk about download stats, which will include some information about the different places where people are listening to the podcast in different countries. Then I will talk about something new that we're going to do. We are going to do live events in which you, the listener, will be able to interact with some of the ladies that you've heard from. I'll talk about in which library archives these oral histories will be deposited. And then I will give a preview of Season 2. So let's get started. In Season 1, you met African American women who descend from Black, white, and mixed race men who fought in the Revolutionary War. These women are direct descendants of these patriots, which makes these men their great, 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 and so forth, great grandfathers. You heard from women ranging in age from our youngest, Diamond Bush, who's a 28-year-old millennial, to Del Jupiter, a 96-year-old from the greatest generation. When I was documenting the oral histories of these ladies, I started to hear some common shared experiences, and some were quite surprising and unexpected to hear from more than one individual. In particular, those that shift our thinking about how this nation was formed, as well as accounts that challenge us to view Black people in America as more than simply victims of slavery, but instead provide a richer narrative to American history. In review of the oral histories that you heard in Season 1, some of the women are still feeling the pain of the suffering of their ancestors, including Adrienne Abiodun, who was working through generational shame, anger, and pain about her white ancestors owning slaves and not being embraced by that side of the family. And Shari Phillips, during the process of applying to become a member of the DAR, she had to answer questions about her lineage. And those questions, it triggered trauma from suffering due to experiencing her ancestors' lives while she was researching her genealogy. We heard about some of the ladies being painfully rejected or denied by white relatives. Alison Morrison, she reached out to a white relative who descended from someone who owned her ancestors in the Battle family. But she was told in no uncertain terms, no one in the white Battle family had ever produced any Black children. And she was told to call this woman's lawyer. Stephanie Miller, she reached out to a white descendant of Norbert Schaesnader, who was the father of her third great-grandfather, Wilmot Schaesnader. And this white descendant denied that Norbert was the father of Wilmot. Joyce Mosley, she reached out to white descendants who didn't know about Richard Murray's second family with Cremona, and they were indifferent to meeting her. Charlotte Chatfield, she had a great-great-great-grandmother, Mary Pendergrass, who was white, and she had a child with a Black man, Abe Horton, in 1871. Now, Mary went on to have children with a white man. And Charlotte reached out to the white descendants of those white children, and they were not interested in hearing anything about their ancestor Mary having a child with a black man. Conversely, we also heard remarkable stories of friendships forged with some of these white relatives. Nikki Williams Sebastian met a white cousin who happened to be Mormon, and he invited her out to Utah to his church. And he stood in front of the congregation and talked about how his ancestors enslaved her ancestor, Ellen. And Ellen had suffered quite a bit because she was there to bear children for the slave owners. Shelly Murphy descended from a mulatto named James Roper, and she met a white woman who was his descendant, and her 95-year-old grandmother was passing for white, and she had no clue that she had this African American ancestry, and she was excited to know the secret that her grandmother took to the grave. In connecting with Shelly Murphy, she was able to learn more. Michelle Campbell. She had an ancestor, John Hart, who had a dual family, both a black family and a white family, and she gathered 200 of the white and black descendants. Joyce Mosley. She met with a white relative who was unaware of her own black DNA due to this woman's grandfather passing for white. Joyce explained the family lineage and was her tour guide, showing her contributions of their family in the Philadelphia area at the Art Museum and the Historic Society. Adrienne Abiodun. She informed the white leader of the Connecticut State Society, Daughters of the American Revolution, that they shared the same Revolutionary War patriot ancestor, James Collins. And in turn, the leader of the Connecticut State Society invited Adrienne to be the keynote speaker at her state conference, in which the rest of the membership learned that she shared ancestry with this black woman, Adrienne, and allowed Adrienne to present their mixed-race family connection to the members. Del Jupiter. As a result of her research, a white family that did not know that they had a mulatto slave ancestor connected with her, and she gave them their family history, and they visited the family grave sites together. We heard from daughters that needed to set the record straight in their family history. Del Jupiter, she dispelled many a family lore. One was that a slave ancestor was born in Spain, but instead she traced her roots back to 1770 Spanish Louisiana. She also discovered that her ancestor was Portuguese instead of Indian, according to family tradition, and she had to translate his Spanish records. Adrienne Abiodun discovered lies on her grandfather's birth certificate. If you haven't heard that episode yet, I'm not going to spoil it for you because there's a nice cliffhanger. Stephanie Miller assumed that her Revolutionary War patriot James II was white and had a child with a black or a Native American woman because she only knew of white descendants of Enoch, James's son, who were always told that James was Scottish, and his sister Serena identified as mulatto. But she ended up finding out that James Dew was, in fact, a free man of color. We also had two daughters that kept their membership in the DAR a secret. Alison Morrison, she hid it from her family for 18 years. And of course, the secret was out when she recorded this oral history and the podcast episode was released. Del Jupiter, she joined back in the 90s. And she kept that a secret not from her family, but from colleagues who she just didn't want them to know that she was a part of the DAR because she did not want to get questioned about why would you want to do that. We also heard complex struggles of racial identity because of the color of their skin. To provide context, when you hear of someone who is black passing for white, during slavery, it was a means of saving your own life, escaping slavery. Later, it became a tactical decision in order to get jobs and have opportunities. But choosing to pass is to lose self, family, community, and family oral history. Because the reality is, passing requires a community. willing to keep that secret, and for others willing to let that person go, even if it's very painful. One of the most complicated oral histories regarding this matter came from Bianca Alexander, in which her Creole culture cousins intermarried. In often cases were first cousins. They intermarried to remain fair-complexioned and preserve their culture. Bianca always knew her grandmother, Lucy Coutee, as white, in contrast to her grandmother's Negro certificate. Her grandmother was shunned by her own family, sent to a Negro school separate from her siblings because she had less European features than her sisters and brothers. Her grandmother ended up deciding to passe blanc, pass for white, and also marrying a black man. Bianca is also in the DAR with other members who descend from the same family line, the Metoyers. And some descendants identify as white and others identify as black. Shelly Murphy's ancestor, Calvin Davis, was a radio gunner passing for white and killed in a World War II plane crash. Shelly Murphy also has an ancestor, James Roper, who was mulatto, and half of the descendants have decided to pass for white, while the others identify as black. Shelly Murphy, her mother could pass for white, but when people ask about her race, she passionately says that she is black. And Shelly Murphy herself gets many questions about her ethnicity, and people force her to choose a race. Although she prefers to say that she is American with African heritage, she does identify as African American. Stephanie Miller, Enoch, who was the son of her Revolutionary War patriot, had a battle between identifying as mulatto or white, and he finally decided to live as white. And there was Joyce Mosley. Her grandmother's brother, Percival Abrams, was colored when he was in Philadelphia and white when he was in Boston, and he cut off his family ties with his siblings he left behind. Now we will discuss oral histories that will challenge you. No matter whether you are black or white, these stories may not sit well with you because they are a departure from what we have all learned and heard about the narrative of African Americans in the United States of America and their history. In the series, some of the women talk about how white men had relationships with black women back in the 17 and 1800s and had children with them. So you may be thinking, hey, we've heard this narrative before. This isn't anything new. What are you sharing that's new? What's new and different is the information about how these white men took care of their black families and passed down their property to them. Michelle Campbell, her ancestor was the prominent John Hart, a white man. He provided for her black ancestor, Hetty Valentine, and their children on his land in the countryside, while also maintaining a white family in the city. And this was acknowledged by the people in the town. And she told stories about the white Uncle Jesse bringing cinnamon rolls out to the country to the black family. And his descendants were granted property. Joyce Mosley, Richard Moray, lived as husband and wife with the mixed race Cremona, although it was illegal. Cremona had been enslaved. He had owned and then freed her. Richard made arrangements for 198 acres of land to be transferred to her, making her one of the richest women in Pennsylvania at the time. Holly Henderson. Her ancestor was T.J. Riley, a white man who had a relationship with a slave named Sally. He petitioned the court to take care of their sons and to leave land to her. Shelly Murphy. Her ancestor, Nicholas Roper, left everything to his mulatto son, who he had with an enslaved woman. Bianca Alexander, her family's Creole social status and wealth was attained in the Cane River, Louisiana community by formerly enslaved Marie Therese Coincoin. She became one of the wealthiest women in Louisiana because she owned land and slaves, resulting from a placage relationship with Frenchman Claude Thomas Pierre Metoyer. Now, we also heard of the reverse situations, white women who were with men of color. Stephanie Miller, her Revolutionary War patriot James Dew was a free man of color living with a white woman in the late 1700s or early 1800s. Charlotte Chatfield, she shared her family history about her white great-great-great-grandmother, Mary Pendergrass, who had a child with a black man, Abe Horton, in 1871. We heard the complicated history of black people owning slaves. Shelly Murphy, her ancestor was James Roper, a mulatto who was the son of Nicholas Roper and an enslaved woman. And Nicholas left everything to his mulatto son, including the slaves. So James ended up owning slaves himself, and he even ended up killing one. Bianca Alexander, her ancestor was the formerly enslaved Marie Therese Coin, one of the wealthiest women in Louisiana. Well, she and her son, Dominique Metoyer, held slaves. But according to the family history, they acquired these slaves because some of them were family members and they wanted to protect them. The women also talked about their ancestors who were free people of color in the late 1700s and early 1800s who established a level of prominence. This is a story beyond the slavery narrative that we commonly hear. Joyce Mosley, her family were very prominent, free people of color in Philadelphia who started their own schools and churches in the late 1700s. Holly Henderson, her third great-grandfather, Peter G. Morgan, was born into slavery and then was selected to write the new Virginia State Constitution and was one of the first blacks in the Virginia House of Delegates. And he was a presidential appointee working as a postmaster in Richmond. Alelia Bundles, her ancestors who descended from her American Revolution soldier Ishmael Roberts, they were pioneers, black people who were pioneers that migrated from North Carolina to Indiana and created free people of color settlements in the early 1800s. And there again, they had their own schools and churches. Diamond Bush, her great uncle, Elisha L. Anthony Jr., was a free person of color who served in Louisiana as a Union Army private in the Civil War. Charlotte Chatfield, she talked about her Welsh ancestry and descending from free people of color of Chatham County, North Carolina. Nikki Williams Sebastian talked about the story of her ancestor Hark West, who was a thoroughbred racehorse trainer of LeCompte, who in 1854 defeated Lexington in New Orleans. She also talked about her ancestor Zachariah Harris, who joined the Union Army as a United States colored troop soldier at Camp Nelson, after which he was awarded Jefferson Davis's property for his service, but the land was taken back by the United States government. We heard how these ladies descend from historical notable figures or how their family had an impact on them. Joyce Mosley, she descends from the first mayor of Philadelphia, Humphrey Moray. Shari Phillips talked about her family's effect on Abraham Lincoln's assassin during an intertwined story concerning the Fugitive Slave Act, which was negotiated by her maternal relative, U.S. Senator Henry Clay, inciting the Christiana riot in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where her paternal ancestors were protecting fugitive slaves, which fueled John Wilkes Booth to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln. Alelia Bundles. She is the great-great-granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker, who was an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, an activist, and a hair care industry pioneer. And Madam C.J. Walker is the subject of a 2020 Netflix series about how she became the first female millionaire, not just the first Black, but the first female self-made millionaire in the United States of America. We have talked a lot about the ancestors of the daughters, but these women are also making history in their own right, and they are accomplishing many things that most people would not necessarily associate with Black women. I was worried about focusing on this particular part and how it would be received by the genealogy diehard community, because in my interviews, I spend quite a bit of time getting to know who these women are, not only to provide context for the research, but to also, in telling their oral history, they are part of their oral history as well. We are capturing the lives of these women, present day Black members of the Daughters of the American Revolution. So I was dedicated to capturing that part of their story because of the research aspect. But when considering having it as a podcast, I was wondering, how would the people who are tuning in just to hear the research, just give me the genealogy, hurry up and get to that part, how would they respond to also having to be patient and listen to what is the history that this woman is creating? Who are you listening to? Who are you meeting today, as one listener said? And to my surprise, that is the part that many of you are telling me you are connecting with, not just the genealogy or the history. The story of Holly Henderson really resonated with a lot of listeners, possibly because they can see themselves in her. Many are parents or are grandparents to children who are on the autism spectrum, and Holly is raising 3 children who are challenged with being on the autism spectrum. She's also a former director of communications for the Maryland Transit Administration, so she made professional strides as well. Less than 4% of scientists are African American, and Alison Morrison is one of them. Michelle Campbell, an electrical engineer. Less than 1% of African American females are awarded electrical engineering degrees. Well, she provided a blueprint for how women can advance to the executive level in corporate America by sharing her story of the rise to leadership in the telecommunications industry, which has included addressing the United Nations on communication solutions during global disasters. Del Jupiter, she was the first Black member of the Florida Pioneer Descendant Society by documenting ancestors living in Florida before it became a state. Adrienne Abiodun. This woman, she is an explorer. She went off the grid in Tajikistan's Wakhan Valley in the Pamir Mountains. Shari Phillips, who grew up on a dairy farm and attended a one-room schoolhouse, started a law practice at 55 years old. Bianca Alexander worked as an educator in Saudi Arabia and as a school principal in Kuwait. Joyce Mosley, she made history by being the first to adopt as a single parent in Philadelphia. And of course, there is Alelia Bundles, an Emmy Award-winning journalist and an author recognized by the New York Times for her biography on her own ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, on which the Netflix series was based. We also heard a lot of stories of survival. Adrienne Abiodun, she survived losing her father, who served in the United States Armed Forces, to him taking his own life due to unaddressed mental trauma, and also losing her hearing at 16 years old from a car accident. Shelly Murphy, she went from being a high school dropout, a victim of domestic abuse, and a young single mother to earning her doctorate and becoming a University of Virginia researcher, investigating President Thomas Jefferson's beloved university and the enslaved laborers who built it. Michelle Campbell's grandmother, Beulah, she joined the Daughters of the American Revolution at 99 years old during the COVID-19 pandemic after surviving the virus a brain tumor from her earlier years, and being shot in the head by white men during a racist attack. In season 1, we were also fortunate to receive media coverage. On July 3rd, some of the daughters that you will be hearing from were featured on NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt. I was interviewed by Dr. Gina Page of African Ancestry on Instagram Live, and I was also interviewed by WTOP, that is Washington, D.C.'s top news radio station, for their podcast called Colors, a dialogue on race in America. That particular interview was a milestone because it was the first major media coverage in which I was finally able to get the study and findings to receive as much attention as my leadership role as a Black member of the Daughters of the American Revolution and my lineage to Thomas Jefferson, because the media historically always gravitates to those particular points. However, I was able to redirect the interview to the project on several occasions. If you've missed them and you want to hear or see any of these media coverages, they are posted on daughterdialogues.com. So let's move on to shout outs and hearing comments from listeners. Over the past 4 months, I have received feedback by listeners leaving comments on the Daughter Dialogues social media pages and some sending emails through the daughterdialogues.com website contact form. And I decided that I wanted to contact some of them to see if they would come on and record their comments in person with me, so you can hear it directly from their voices. And I didn't know any of these people. The only people that I know personally are the 2 women from Maryland from which you heard comments up front in the beginning of the episode. They are DAR members in the state in which I am a state officer, and they know me through the work in the DAR. But the state of Maryland has 3,000 members, and I did not ask them to listen to my podcast. They chose to on their own, and I just wanted to share their comments with you. What I have found is that the greatest number of comments that I receive come from white members of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Well, that makes a lot of sense because there are 180,000 members in the DAR, and this story very much pertains to their organization. And let's face it, there's not that many Black members. We talked about how the DAR does not keep an official record of race, so we don't have an exact count of the numbers, but to date, we estimate it's approximately a few hundred of Black members in the DAR. Of course, plenty of Black members in the DAR are listening to the podcast, but I'm not featuring their comments because hopefully you will hear from them as one of my interview subjects in a future episode. So let's hear from some of the white members of the DAR and find out, why are they listening to the Daughter Dialogues podcast? Why do they want to hear about the lives of Black women and their family lineage?
My name is Ann Tabus, and I live in Missouri. I look forward to each of the Daughters Dialogues with anticipation. Who am I going to get the chance to meet? An author, an Emmy Award winner, an entrepreneur, a world traveler, a professional genealogist, a strong woman who homeschools her special needs children and still finds ways to advocate for other children, a veteran who proudly served in the past and continues to find ways to serve. And where will their journeys into their family's past take me? What stories will they tell me and share? What mysteries will they unravel? Each dialogue is a rare opportunity to see into the lives and form a connection with women I might never otherwise have a chance to meet. It's a chance to share and celebrate our love of family and our desire to know our roots, and a chance to widen the lens through which I view the world, look at the world in a different perspective, and yet confirm what I've always believed, that we are so much more alike than we are different.
My name is Morgane Mary Beck, and I'm from Virginia. Oh, these stories move me to tears because they're real. They're heartfelt. They are the actual work of a person's life and their ancestors being told in a truthful fashion and in a way that most of us have not heard. These are the kind of people I want to know and the kind of history I want told. This is the news I want to hear because it gives me hope. It gives me a light around what's going on in our country as a person who believes in the wonderful nature of diversity. And I want that to be part of our story, DAR story and our nation's story and our world story and my personal life, especially as a woman who is white. I have not heard most of these stories, and they are hard to hear. And yet they are the truth of our nation's history, our white privilege, my white privilege. And in order for our country and our organization to move in the direction that our nation's founders wanted in their heart of hearts, in their ideals, we need to do this work and hear these stories and make these kinds of changes happen. These are the stories that light my fire and that I spread and share because I want others to know. And I think that's how we create change. I want to be part of the work to explode negative stereotypes with unexpected stories and doing it through engaging others. That's what I love too, is that women have so many different dimensions.
Right. Yes.
And the personal story is absolutely what engages me. I mean, it's the depth and variety. Oh, it just blows my mind every time I read one or hear one. Oh, what? These human beings are out there. I don't know them, number one, until now. And number two, they're part of DAR. That's like a double explosive right there.
My name is Patsy Hopkins, and I'm from Illinois. It is important to learn history from every source possible. That is why I listen to Daughter Dialogues. Each episode features a daughter who tells her personal genealogy history. There isn't a dialogue that hasn't moved me to tears in my eyes and a lump in my throat. My heart is always filled with admiration for my distinguished sisters for sharing their family background of hardship and how their ancestors paved the way for them and future generations. The heartbreak of what their great-grandparents, and in some cases grandparents, endured in just trying to live a life and not being allowed to do that and being suppressed. It's just a topic that tears me up inside. I am very interested in it because it makes my heart smile that these ladies in particular that are featured on the dialogues have come from some very diverse backgrounds and situations, and look at their success. Look at how far their families came and some of the things these ladies do. That is inspirational. And as a privileged white person, I mean, my life hasn't always been easy, but I've worked very hard to get to where I am. And it's just an inspiration to see people, not just Black women, but all people, do something very well with their lives and their careers and make a difference for future generations. And that's why those dialogues, that's why I enjoy them so much. I read a lot of books that talk about slavery and all the different skin colors that endured slavery. And it's an inspiration that these ladies, their roots, that's where their roots came from. And instead of letting that bog them down, they just hit the ball out of the ballpark. And they're inspiring other people with the stories that they tell, their history. I hate to use the word stories because they're not stories. It's factual information.
When I was combing through the comments that I received online, I found a few who were not members of the DAR, and they just so happened to be Black people. So let's hear from them.
This is Bernice Alexander Bennett, and I'm from Silver Spring, Maryland. What I felt was that The dialogues represented a significant contribution to the African American story. And because these are daughters, I felt that this was so significant. And these are stories that I believe people need to hear. Also, I just like the give and take, the way that you can draw them out and have these women share a lot about who they are. And this is significant so that people can understand you're talking to ordinary people that have had a significant event to take place within their lives. And they have chosen, because they know their history, to become a member of the daughters. I love hearing the stories.
My name is Trisha Cummings, and I live in Arkansas. I love the fact that this podcast not only highlights Black women in the Daughters of the American Revolution, but also highlights the age range, not only of that organization, but as genealogists and family historians as a whole. Because as I've listened to the podcast, there have been people in their 20s up to their 90s that you've been able to interview. And I just think it's very important that people know that there's not an age block for family historians. I keep coming back to hear more podcasts because I'm just intrigued by the different women that you have interviewed, and everybody's story, although, you know, the core is about their Revolutionary War patriot, but there's so much more to their story, how they grew up, their education, their family. It's just so much more to them. As historians, sometimes we forget about ourselves because we're so busy researching other people. And your podcast helps people to remember that our story as the historian is just as important as our ancestors.
My name is Brandon Donnell, and I live in the state of Connecticut. So I listen to Daughter Dialogues to really understand, get a perspective of why people of color have joined the DAR. I've actually have determined from my research that I descend from a couple of patriots. And for a couple of years now, I've kind of been debating potentially joining the Sons of the American Revolution. And so I wanted to kind of hear perspectives of some of the ladies and how they've been interacting with the society overall. So I think it's been a very interesting time to listen to specifically the different perspectives and different family backgrounds that people have. I would say the biggest thing is people's passion to let their family history stories be told. I think good, bad, indifferent, no matter how people may feel about it, I think all of our stories deserve to be told. And I think that the Daughters allows a great platform to allow that to be heard. And it lets me realize that, you know, some of those common stories, it's not just you alone, but other people have similar situations. I remember, I think a couple of weeks ago, there was a young lady that talked about, especially in North Carolina, this is where originally I'm from, where you have intersection between free people of color, enslaved, and then descended from enslavers as well. So I know that that's just not a rarity, but, you know, a lot of people have experienced that and have been able to document that within their family history as well. The biggest thing that I get from it is the generational thing. I mean, Dale Jupiter's, who's in the 90s, you have people like Dr. Shelly Murphy in the 60s. And I think there was someone that was in the 30s like myself earlier. So I think I like to hear different perspectives. No matter what area of you're talking about, genealogy, you know, professional development, anything like that, I like to hear generational perspective. So I think I'm raised by a woman. I have grandmother, aunts, and all of that. So to me, it was just kind of like I'm listening to either my sisters or my aunties or my grandmama talk.
I want to shout out followers who have shared a good number of Daughter Dialogues social media posts. The shares are critically important. By your sharing a social media post about an episode or sharing it with someone that you know helps us disseminate these untold histories so they can be heard. Without your help, I can't do it alone. So it's because of you, and it's because of the names that I'm going to mention, that people are hearing this. Sunny Staubach, Janet Fulton, Our Hidden Roots, History's Untold Treasures, Megan Ferrara, Lauren Eichowitz, the North Carolina, Delaware, Colorado, and Wisconsin State Society's Daughters of the American Revolution, the Great Bridge, Harrisburg, David Hall, and Santa Clara chapters, DAR, and the Madison County DAR Juniors. On Twitter, Family Tree Tips UK in the United Kingdom. You have been so loyal in retweeting all of my posts. You are awesome. Thank you for your support. And last is Gwen Dapper Gebrocht from the Los Gatos, California. I am very grateful that you were spreading the word about Daughter Dialogues in your newsletter, and you wrote such a wonderful synopsis of the series. Thank you so much for that. If I haven't mentioned your name, please don't get upset, because there's always a danger in doing these things, because you'll ultimately always miss someone, and it's impossible to say thank you to everyone. I just wanted to mention a few to show my appreciation for the comments that I've seen on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and through email. It does give me the energy and the motivation to continue doing this work. I can't see your names just through the podcast hosting software. I don't know who you are. I can just see the location in which you're listening. For all listeners, not just members of the Daughters of the American Revolution, this podcast is certainly not limited to DAR listeners. And it is my sincere hope that I will continue to hear from listeners who are outside of the organization as well. So if you want to hear your name on the podcast, or for me to read out some of your comments, I need you to contact me either through one of the social media sites or through the daughterdialogues.com contact form. Okay, time to geek out on numbers. According to the Daughter Dialogues podcast hosting company, there have been 8,000 downloads of episodes since we first published on July 1st. So what does this mean? Download simply means listen. So Daughter Dialogues has been listened to 8,000 times over the past 4 months. And there are 30 plus million episodes out there on the market from which listeners can choose. And according to the industry numbers, Daughter Dialogues ranks in the top 40% of all podcast episodes. And that is obviously thanks to you, the individual listeners. So let's talk about from where are people listening. The podcast hosting company only provides a list of city names, and sometimes those cities are a couple of miles off. So it's not necessarily pinpoint accuracy. The top cities that have listened include Ashburn, Virginia, Lake Stevens, Washington State, Dallas, Texas, and Atlanta, Georgia. Following close behind are Chicago, Illinois, Houston, Texas, Chesapeake, Virginia, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Charlotte, North Carolina, and Seattle, Washington. And we have some international listeners: Edmonton and Alberta, Canada. Very loyal listeners there. That is the top international location for Daughter Dialogues listeners. And right behind Canada is Clichy, France. It's an area just outside of Paris. And if you're listening, please contact me through either social media or the daughterdialogues.com contact form. I would love to hear from you and find out more about why you're listening to Daughter Dialogues. Are you a DAR member in a unit overseas? Or are you French and you just find these narratives very intriguing? We also have a few downloads from Sweden, Germany, Chile, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Moving on to live events. This is so exciting. Daughter Dialogues will be hosting virtual live events. So that means online. Listeners will be able to meet the women that you have been hearing from and ask them questions live. So although you won't be getting a weekly Thursday podcast release episode during the time between season 1 and when we return for season 2 on the first Thursday of February, you will be able to hear from them and meet them on Thursdays in January. So you will still be able to get your Thursday fix from some of you that I've heard of that says Thursday is your favorite day of the week because you get to hear a new Daughter Dialogues podcast episode. So now on Thursdays in January, you will be able to engage with these women live, and it will be called Dialogue with the Daughters. In order to find out exactly the time and where we will be doing this, you will need to check Daughter Dialogues social media pages on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And most importantly, the most reliable way is for you to subscribe to the Daughter Dialogues newsletter. You simply go to daughterdialogues.com and scroll down to the bottom and click subscribe. All newsletter subscribers will receive the latest updates on events that we are doing. You will receive a reminder of when the season 2 will start, so you won't miss any episodes, and you receive notifications each time a new episode is published. So it's really important for you to subscribe to the newsletter so you won't miss anything. So now let's talk about the library and where these oral histories will be deposited. My study has been made possible by Harvard University's W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. However, as an independent researcher, there was not a predetermined, let's just say, end game for this study. That was left to me, and I had set a goal of having this oral history project deposited into the Schlesinger Library on the history of women in America at Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute. I am proud to announce that the Daughter Dialogues Oral History Project has been officially accepted for deposit in the Schlesinger Library archives at Harvard University. The recordings and accompanying documentation, such as the biographies of each woman, will be made available to researchers and preserved into perpetuity, allowing the narratives to live for generations to come. So I'll tell you about Schlesinger so you can get just as excited as I am, because this is a big deal. Schlesinger Library on the history of women in America at Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute is arguably the world's largest archive devoted to the history of both individual women and women's organizations. The library's holdings are especially strong in women's rights and feminism, health and sexuality, work and family life, culinary history and etiquette, as well as education and the professions. Notable collections include the papers of the National Organization for Women, Amelia Earhart's baby book, scrapbooks, and letters, and the diaries, correspondence, speeches, and memorabilia of fellow sister and the Daughters of the American Revolution, Susan B. Anthony. The library also houses the papers of Black activist and scholar Angela Davis, who was jailed in 1970 on murder charges, sparking an international Free Angela campaign. She was later acquitted by an all-white jury in 1972. The collection includes items such as the letters she received from supporters while incarcerated, a 120-page diary she kept during her trial, a manuscript of her autobiography marked with edits and comments in the margins by her friend Toni Morrison, and unpublished speeches. The Black Women Oral History Project consists of interviews with 72 African American women recorded between 1976 and 1981, and is still one of the library's most used research collections. Initially funded in part by the Rockefeller Foundation, the project recorded Black women across the country who had made significant contributions to American society during the first half of the 20th century. The interviews explore family backgrounds, marriages, childhood, education and training, significant influences affecting narrators' choices, professional and voluntary accomplishments, union activities, and the ways in which being Black and a woman affected narrators' options and the choices made. Notable interviews include Rosa Parks and Dorothy Height, who were active in civil rights, and Dorothy West, a short story writer and journalist. Daughter Dialogues will be housed in the company of these esteemed collections and the other historic holdings at the Schlesinger Library on the history of women in America at Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute. And last, a preview of Season 2. You will hear from the very first recognized Black member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. She joined in 1977, and I really want to know what shaped her into becoming a woman who'd want to break that type of barrier. As we know that in 1977, it was a very different society. Why did she want to be the first? What was her upbringing like that molded her into such a pioneer? She is still a member to this day. How has her views changed, or have they changed, about how she sees herself and being a patriotic citizen in the United States of America? What does she think about being in the company of other Black members now in the Daughters of the American Revolution? Why did she join? How did she find out that she had a Revolutionary War patriot? This is well before the internet or the relative ease of researchers today of typing in a name into a family tree online. What challenges did she face in both her research and becoming a member? What was the reaction when she walked into the room as the very first Black member of the DAR? Her name is Karen Batchelor. Look, she even made popular history. She was the final clue on the game show Jeopardy! The clue read, tracing her family to William Hood of 18th century Pennsylvania, Karen Batchelor made news as this organization's first African American member. We will hear her story in honor of Black History Month when we return on the first Thursday of February. Until then, subscribe to the newsletter at daughterdialogues.com to receive updates. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and meet us in January for online virtual events where you can engage live with the women that you have heard from in Season 1.
I like to hear other people's stories. I like to hear about other people's lives.
Everything that you're doing is very important, and I just am thankful that you are doing this.
Each dialogue is a rare opportunity for me to see into the lives and form a connection with women I might otherwise never have met. Keep these coming, and one of my favorite things to do is to grab my phone, and I curl up with a glass of wine, and I say, who can I visit with tonight?